Exodus, parting the Red or Reed Sea Moses.
Exodus states that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Barring the theory of divine intervention, there may be another interesting explanation for these events. Moses knew the desert well. He also knew the habits of the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea as it was known then. This sea from the Bible may have actually been little more than a tidal swamp that regularly flooded during the day and dried out at night when the sea winds started blowing. Moses would have been aware of this cycle and could have deduced that if the Hebrews simply waited overnight, the sea would part long enough for the Israelites to cross, closing in behind them when the tide returned. This would trap the Egyptians, as their heavy chariots would be stuck in the mud.
The Exodus, pillars of smoke and fire Moses.
During the period in which Moses famously led the Israelites out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, commanders would usually keep their armies in line by walking ahead of them with a burning brazier. During the day, the army followed the brazier's smoke signal, and at night, the light of its open flame. These are most likely the pillars of smoke by day and fire by night mentioned in Exodus. The Hebrews may or may not have been following the angel of the Lord, but they were almost certainly following Moses with a common signaling brazier. However, according to the biblical account, the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. If this account is accurate, Moses moved the brazier behind his column instead of ahead of it. This undoubtedly confused the Egyptians, who, knowing what the signal meant, probably thought the column had reversed course after getting lost in the desert and started doubling back towards them. At night, the bright brazier light behind Moses' coterie blinded the Egyptians, preventing them from seeing the Hebrews on the other side. They believed the Hebrews had made camp, but in reality, they were stealthily sneaking across the now dry tidal marsh. By the time Pharaoh recognized the deception, it was too late. The tide had already come in, making it impossible for the Pharaoh's men to follow them.
Vietnam War 1955 to 1975, the Viet Cong.
Right down the coast from China, and having learned tactics from the Japanese in WWII, the North Vietnamese who battled American and European forces were true believers in the power of deception. Like the Japanese at Iwo Jima, they tunneled underground to turn seemingly harmless swatches of jungle into invisible fortresses, regularly using feigned retreats and feigned weakness, and often launching diversionary strikes as means to steer troops where they wanted them to go. The VC exploited every possible weakness of the American troops. The VC set up networks of American-friendly bars, restaurants, and brothels to stay as close to the enemy as possible. Anyone the soldiers interacted with in these locations could have been a spy. While these infiltrators did often engage in acts of violence or sabotage, secondarily, they would feed misinformation back to trusting soldiers and commanders, setting them up for ambushes while chasing after shadow armies.
Iwo Jima, 1945, Japanese Armed Forces.
In the Marines' island-hopping campaign to reach Japan's mainland, the battles for most islands were difficult, especially against the Japanese. They were masters of camouflage, booby traps, and surprise attacks, and were known to dig tunnels through the concrete-like limestone rock of islands. The tiny island of Iwo Jima was no exception, but Forces hugely underestimated the extent of Japan's fortifications. Iwo Jima wasn't a seemingly peaceful island with a few tunnels. It was a fortress carved into a rock. When the 110,000 men of the Allied forces landed, they expected to encounter several thousand Japanese and the usual assortment of artillery and arms. What they found instead was a well-armed hornet's nest bristling with gun emplacements, coastal artillery, 21,000 Japanese troops, and 11 miles of underground tunnels to move and supply them. This was all under a seemingly idyllic island barely 2 miles wide. But the Japanese were eventually defeated. The battle cost 7,000 American lives, 19,000 wounded, 1 sunken escort carrier ship, and 2 more carriers damaged. It is said that Iwo Jima was the final straw in Truman's decision to launch a nuclear attack on Hiroshima.
The Trojan Horse, circa 1200 B. Odysseus.
During the Trojan War, Odysseus famously crafted a giant wooden horse, the emblem of the city of Troy, and filled it with thousands of armed men. He told the Trojan leaders that his gift was an offering to the goddess Athena, whose temple had been destroyed by the Greeks. They accepted the gift, and as soon as the horse was safely inside the city walls, Odysseus' men climbed out and massacred the city.
Codebreaking and counter-intel. WWII Allies.
The Allies have just broken Japan's most important and secure naval code, JN-25. In Europe, the British have used the Colossus computer to break Germany's Lorentz and Enigma ciphers. They are now reading the enemy's mail, accessing everything they are saying and doing, and everything they think about what the Allies themselves are doing. At this point, they find themselves in an ethical bind. They can't openly act on this information without risking the enemy changing the codes. However, they need to maximize the power they've gained through their discoveries to get an edge on both Germany and Japan. The great deception that solved this dilemma was counterintelligence. When the Allies would find out the Japanese fleet was going to be in a certain place at a certain time, they'd place ships at those predetermined coordinates to intercept them. They would then send out messages in a code they knew the Japanese had already broken, discussing how lucky they were that their Allied ships happened to be in the right place at the right time. The Allies did the same in Europe, fabricating entire missions that failed at their intended objective, but just so happened to be in the best possible position to keep a panzer division from crossing a bridge. These messages were intended to be intercepted by the Nazis, who would never know that their code had been broken.
The Valley Campaign, 1862. Thomas Stonewall Jackson.
Robert E. Lee gets his fair share of rightly deserved press for being an aggressive, intelligent commander, but objectively, Thomas Stonewall Jackson was most likely the more tactically gifted of the two Confederate generals. Jackson's 16,000-man force wasn't exactly small, but it paled in comparison to the 52,000 Union soldiers drawing down on the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia during the first major offensive Union movement. To compensate for this disparity, Jackson bluffed, seeking to meet up with Lee in defense of Richmond. Jackson suddenly found the epicenter of convergence of both halves of the Union Army. Had the Union known of Jackson's mere 16,000 men, they would have crushed Jackson's forces. However, Jackson had sending infiltrators out among enemy lines, spreading rumors that his force numbered in the 6 digits. As the Union forces closed in on both sides, Jackson's force marched his army from one side of the valley to the other, engaging the two halves in turn with his full force. After driving one army back, he force marched to the other side of the valley and fight the other. Eventually, the Union came to believe the whole area was swarming with hundreds of thousands of Confederate troops, never knowing it was just Jackson bouncing his smaller force back and forth. The Union withdrew and began to flee until the side led by General Nathaniel Banks found Jackson waiting in front of them at their own garrison at Front Royal. Banks was running away from Jackson to resupply. Jackson had snuck around them on a train, joined up with another force, captured Banks's own garrison. Lincoln eventually ordered a full-scale retreat from the area, believing that Stonewall Jackson's massive army was simply inescapable.
Battle of the Kalka River, 1223 A. Ghengis Khan.
This battle took place along the Kalka River in Ukraine between 80,000 Russians, or Kievan Rus, as they were known at the time, and 20,000 of Ghengis Khan's mounted raiders. After years of terrorizing the Russians, one of Khan's raiding parties resulted in the death of the king of the former Byzantine vassal state of Georgia. The Russians assembled an army and took off in pursuit of Ghengis raiders. They easily knocked back the raiders, who broke off into a panicked retreat. The Mongols' 1,000-strong rear guard bought them some time, but eventually they too ran away, keeping just ahead of the Russians' advance. Russia chased after them, right into Khan's trap. Khan had reassembled his main force and hidden it near a narrow pass by the river. This was almost exactly the same strategy Hannibal had employed at Lake Trasimene 1,000 years before, but in this instance, the feigned retreat was what drew the Russians into their own killbox. One group of Russians panicked and turned back to run away. This left a gaping hole in the Russian lines, and Khan's mounted warriors poured through. The Russian casualties from the battle amounted to at least 75,000. Likely the only people to escape Khan's clutches were those who had fled.
The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 Russia.
Russia has long been one of the great masters of military deception. They even developed a comprehensive system for it called Maskurovka, the early 20th century. Maskurovka is a full suite of techniques including camouflage, disinformation, deceptive movements, decoys, feigned retreats, and deliberate losses, among other methods. Russia utilized these tactics in Operation Uranus, the setup for Hitler's crushing defeat at Stalingrad. Stalin used many of the same tactics as the Allies at Normandy, but added a few more, playing on Hitler's ego and self-delusion. He ordered fake trenches to be dug around the city, feigning a desperate last stand of the infantry, and sent scores of his own troops on suicide missions to deliberately lose small skirmishes with the Germans outside of town. Once Hitler's confidence was at an all-time high, he committed almost his entire Russian area force to storm Stalingrad in an overwhelming show of force. After Hitler's million-man force was comfortable within the quiet, empty city of Stalingrad, Russian tanks, artillery, and troops sprung out of hiding all around them. Mimicking his predecessor, Hannibal, Stalin trapped the Germans in a classic double envelopment, accordingly annihilating them. The Germans suffered 850,000 casualties out of the 1 million troops committed, along with 900 aircraft, 500 tanks, and 6,000 artillery pieces. Stalingrad is said to have been the single most decisive battle of WWII, having permanently ended Hitler's ambitions on the Eastern Front.
Lake Trasimene, 217b. Hannibal.
Hannibal is undoubtedly a top contender for the title of history's greatest commander. The Battle of Trasimene was history's first use of the strategic turning movement and remains to date the largest and most lethal ambush of all time. Hannibal began the ambush by baiting Roman general Flaminius to chase his force through the countryside. Hannibal's first tactic was to move between Flaminius and his supply lines to Rome, getting behind his defensive line and forcing his army to move. They chased Hannibal to the north shore of Lake Trasimene and into a narrow pass between the lake and surrounding hills. Earlier in the night, Hannibal had sent men miles ahead to light campfires, causing Flaminius to believe Hannibal's forces were still distant. Using the early morning fog of the lake for cover, his entire force took advantage of Flaminius' ignorance to surround his ranks, taking them in the flank and trapping them on all sides. Hannibal wiped out half of Flaminius' 30,000-man army, while losing only 2,500 soldiers of his own.
Battle of the Hydaspes, 326 B. Alexander the Great.
The Hydaspes River is the largest and westernmost river of the Punjab, and was, in ancient times, effectively the western border of India. On the Indian side was an area called Kaurava, ruled over by King Porus. On the European side lay the expanded domain of Persia, now ruled over by Alexander the Great. Alexander had already proven his might by conquering the entire known world from his home in the small Greek town of Macedonia. Having accomplished his goal and proven his genius, Alexander decided to push east past the mighty Hydaspes to conquer whatever lay on the other side. Porus saw Alexander's massive army coming, however, and lay in wait on the other side of the river, watching the opposing army like a hawk. If Alexander moved down, Porus moved with him. But Alexander watched Porus as well. Seeing how Porus followed him, Alexander instructed small groups of his army to march up. Eventually, Porus's troops became accustomed to the practice and stopped paying close attention to the clanking coming from the other side. Quietly, Alexander began withdrawing his main force back and away from the river, leaving the noisy cavalry on its shore to march back and forth every day. Porus assumed he was looking at the front of Alexander's entire force. He didn't know that the main body of his enemy's infantry was stealthily sneaking toward the only crossing upstream. Porus finally deduced the situation, but was too late to act. Alexander had crossed the river and whipped around behind Porus's army. As Porus turned to face him, Alexander's mounted cavalry charged across the river and attacked Porus from behind. Porus lost 23,000 compared to less than 1,000 of Alexander's troops.
D-Day landing at Normandy, 1944 Allies.
The many deceptions involved in the Normandy landings are legendary in both American and global history. Hitler knew the Allied invasion of Europe was coming, but he didn't know exactly where his enemy would land, rendering the proper positioning of his troops practically impossible. Prior to the invasion, British intelligence fed the Germans misinformation about where the invasion would land through a number of double agents. Probably the most influential of these, Garbo, managed to convince Hitler that the invasion would land 100 miles from Normandy. The Allied generals, including future President Dwight Eisenhower, fed that delusion with false radio traffic, misleading messages, and armies of decoy tanks and trucks that looked legitimate from more than 50 feet away. This pattern of deception enabled the Allied troops to attack German forces with enormous success. The D-Day campaign stands as perhaps the greatest and most successful use of deliberate deception in 20th century warfare.
Cannae, 216b. Hannibal.
legendary battle is the one that both put Hannibal into the history books and reportedly resulted in a word most of us have used at least once. After Rome's crushing defeat at Lake Trasimene, and after growing impatient with the brilliant Fabian strategy of simply waiting out Hannibal's next strike, the empire made what might be the worst mistake in the history of war. They sent an 80,000-strong army out to meet Hannibal's force of 50,000 in all-out battle. After selecting the battlefield himself, he placed his huge cavalry forces in blocks at either end, though to the Romans, the line looked perfectly straight. They hit Hannibal's center hard, and the bowed line was pushed back. The edges, however, held their ground. Thinking they were inching towards victory, Rome pushed forward until Hannibal's bow inverted and his flanks began wrapping around Rome's. Eventually, the Romans were boxed in on three sides, and Hannibal sent his cavalry round behind them to close the box and attack from the rear. This was history's very first use of the classic double envelopment. Hannibal had reduced Rome's military to nothing, or ad nihil in Latin. The French later adapted ad nihil into the word annihilate.
Hey guys, thank you so much for the support and likes and comments down below, and also thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to see you in the next video. Then take care, bye.